I know I've said this multiple times since I started this channel and started covering Resident Evil, but Code Veronica is probably one of my favorite Resident Evil titles, mainly because it is just such a great game and the story is just so good. And now that we're in 2025, it means we're getting much closer to seeing some kind of announcement for either a new remake or Resident Evil 9. And if I had to choose between the two, I would really hope for Resident Evil 9. But if we don't get an announcement for that anytime soon, Code Veronica is next on that list, mainly because Code Veronica is just such an amazing game. So, with the possible news that we might be able to get a remake announcement this year, it's made me want to go back and take a look at what made Resident Evil Code Veronica so great to begin with. And in a way, we could look at this as, like, what are some things that Capcom should keep for the remake and what are some things that Capcom should get rid of? Because one of the main things that Capcom has had a problem with these remakes is picking and choosing what certain things can go and what certain things can stay. We saw that with so many of the other remakes, like especially for Resident Evil 3's remake, and just going back and taking a look at this can help us break down what are some things that we might actually see get taken out of the game. But before we get into that, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and also comment your thoughts down below. I really enjoy reading your comments, mainly because it adds a different perspective to some things that maybe I don't consider when I make these videos. So I love reading those. But with that out of the way, let's get into the video. Now, I am going to do a brief little bit of background on Resident Evil Code Veronica, just for the people who have not played this game. It's really good, I highly recommend checking it out, but this game originally released on the Sega Dreamcast in 2000, and it was eventually released for PlayStation 2 as Code Veronica X, and this included new cutscenes and extra game modes. The game would eventually end up finding a place on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 years later, and the game takes place after the events of Resident Evil 2 and follows concurrently to the destruction of Raccoon City in Resident Evil 3. In Code Veronica, you play as Claire and Chris Redfield, as both siblings are moving from Rockford Island to a hidden base in the Antarctic. They are trying to save one another, obviously, and they will eventually end up finding each other towards the end of the game. Along the way, Claire meets Steve Burnside, who is a young man who is imprisoned on the island, who was also with his father, who was an ex-Umbrella employee. His father ends up becoming infected and is eventually killed by Steve. Both Steve and Claire have to go up against Albert Wesker, who plays a side antagonist, with the main villains being Alfred and Alexia Ashford. They're basically evil twins who are working with Umbrella. I'm not going to spoil the ending, but this game has such a well-crafted story, and there's just so many gameplay elements that I love about this game. It makes it such a wild ride. It's fun and challenging at the same time. Now, I want to quickly get into these gameplay elements that made this game so incredible, and then talk about which things can be removed from the remake and which should stay in the remake. So let's get into that. So one of the first things that comes to mind in what should stay in the remake is the enemy variety. This game, in its original format, had so many different bosses and enemies that made this game feel extremely unique in comparison to games like Resident Evil 2 and 3. For example, with this game, we had zombies, Cerberus dogs, albinoids, and hunters. These enemies are familiar if you've played the original games, but this game also had new enemies that you had to deal with, like gulpworms, moths, bats, tentacles, spiders, sweepers, and sweepers are basically similar to hunters but are pretty annoying to fight on the hardest difficulty. These enemies added a level of difficulty to each area, because even if you had played the game several times and knew when and where they would spawn, each of these enemies always had a level of unpredictability to them, and conserving ammo was always a huge key in being able to get around these enemies, along with being able to strafe run by them, of course. So my hope is that Capcom does not cut any of these enemies out of the remake, because without these enemies, it might make the game way too easy to play and finish. And considering how short this game is in comparison to the other installments of Resident Evil, they really need to keep these enemies in. There's really no bottom line to this. Maybe getting rid of the moths might be something they could do, but I would like to see all of these enemies included in some way, shape, or form. The boss enemies are also a huge part of this as well, because Alexia and Nosferatu are the two big boss fights along with the Tyrant that you fight during the escape of Rockford Island on the plane. Now, out of these fights, I think the Tyrant fight should be adjusted instead of being removed, because in the original game, I would like to say that this was probably the hardest boss, if not Alexia's boss fight being extremely hard. The tank controls plus the tight space on the plane made it extremely hard to get past this part, and I can't tell you how many times I had to restart from the beginning because I did not follow my own advice and just conserve ammo. Like I said though, I would like them to fix this fight and not outright remove it, because I believe it is the perfect first boss fight to give you an idea of what you're going to get yourself into in this game. Which leads me to my next point about ammo conservation and inventory management. So, one of the biggest staples in the Resident Evil franchise is its inventory management. This has always played a major role in its games, even as the games have become designed more for modern audiences. This feature has still stuck around in its most simplest form. The inventory system works like this. You basically have the same space management as Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3, with the item box still playing a huge role in this. In Code Veronica, you basically can switch between Claire and Chris throughout the game. Now, this is vitally important because this makes you decide on which weapons you feel are necessary to give up in order for Chris to be able to use during his portion of the game. This adds a level of difficulty because you need to plan out what weapons are going to be effective for which challenges that the characters have to go through. But like I mentioned before, if you don't conserve your ammo and just go in guns blazing, you might end up in a situation where you run out of ammo and you end up stuck at a boss fight where you end up only having to use your knife to get through the fight. It basically turns a 6-hour, maybe 7-hour game into like a 10-hour game real quick. I really like this inventory management system, and I really hope that some form of this stays in the future remake, because without it, the game would just be way too easy. I know they need to market the game for a wider audience, but if they could just add the option to keep this system in while also implementing whatever new system they have, I'm sure this would make classic Resident Evil fans very happy. So one of the few things that Resident Evil fans have noticed over the last few remakes is the amount of cut content that are in the new remakes. And we saw this with Resident Evil 4, but not in a very bad degree as what we saw with Resident Evil 3. Resident Evil 3 got shafted the worst, in my opinion, and I still think it's one of the worst Resident Evil remakes to come out. But I think with Resident Evil Code Veronica, the way that they can prevent this is by keeping in the locations that are integral to the game's story and still hold the structure of the original game. And this would mean that the developers would need to have the same amount of passion that they had for the Resident Evil 4 remake in order for this to work. But next, I want to go over what content that they should probably not cut out in the new Code Veronica remake. Let's get into that. So I know this is an unrealistic expectation to have from a company that cuts out so much content from their older games, but these areas are just so important to the story of the game. I mean, we've got areas like the prison, the military training facility, the palace, the airport, the private residence, Antarctica base, and the Antarctica laboratories. And these are just the main areas. I mean, these areas are broken up into smaller rooms that makes the game feel even bigger than what it actually might be. But for a game that was released on the Sega Dreamcast, it feels like a huge map to explore with multiple different rooms. It's just so much fun to play this game. Now, the main things that fans want is for Capcom to keep these rooms and areas as is, because it creates such an eerie and horrific environment and makes you question all of the different types of story beats that are going on and what kind of experiments the Umbrella might have been doing on this island. Personally, I would be okay if they changed the map layout, but still keep the rooms like with Resident Evil 2, because that layout in the original Resident Evil 2 is a nightmare in comparison to the remake, where it feels like the pacing is much better. If they did that with this game, I wouldn't be too mad about that. But they still need to keep some of these areas in the game and try to keep the story as similar to the original as possible. So another thing I really hope that they try to keep the same are the puzzles. As many of you know, Resident Evil has always been well known for their puzzles and the creative aspect to some of these puzzles. And in the older games, a lot of these puzzles force you to backtrack and explore more of the map before you can progress forward. One of the puzzles that I really like in particular is the painting puzzle that's in the palace. And this is mainly because I thought it was really cool and very creative and a fun reminder of the light puzzle that Resident Evil Remastered had. And another one that I really liked was the Alexia paperweight puzzle because it reveals one of the funniest twists, I think, in Resident Evil history. I really feel like it's worth mentioning this because a lot of the newer Resident Evil games have watered down a lot of their puzzles, and I don't know. I feel like if they don't keep these puzzles, they should add new ones to replace them that'll make the gameplay a little bit smoother. And I personally wouldn't mind seeing some of these original puzzles make it into the remake, but with a puzzle difficulty option. Silent Hill had that, and I feel like it works really well with these types of games and makes it better for people who maybe don't like to have to suffer through challenging puzzles every time they play a game. But yeah, that was one of my favorite things about this game, and let's just move into my next topic here. Now, the last topic I want to talk about is the story, and I'm going to go over this real quick, and then I'm going to go into some of my complaints about Code Veronica, which there are very few complaints that I have for this game. But the story is obviously the most important one, as if this game did not have a great story, then we would not have the game we know and love today. And Resident Evil Code Veronica was a special look into the franchise because we finally got to see the bond between Chris and Claire, more than we were able to in Resident Evil 2, as Chris did not make an appearance. But with Resident Evil Code Veronica, we really got to see the dedication that each sibling has for one another in making sure they are safe and far away from dangerous companies like Umbrella and the Ashford family. And it's not even just being able to get insight into that relationship, but we are also introduced to some new characters and new lore to the franchise about the original T-virus outbreak. And we get to meet this weird guy, Alfred Ashford, who dresses up as his sister, Alexia, and is basically the catalyst behind the unfreezing of his real sister, Alexia, who has been infected by her own version of the virus and does everything in her power to make sure nobody escapes from the facility alive. And instead of the narrative that we were used to in Resident Evil 2 with the different stories for Claire and Leon, we got to see the story broken up in a way that really shows and conveys the narrative in such an amazing and fun way. You get to flash between both Claire and Chris, and it's so much better than breaking up two different campaigns into two different options in the main menu. The story is just always so great. Every time you start this game, it immediately makes you want to finish it. You don't just start it and get bored halfway through. I really hope that the remake is still able to capture that great storytelling, and I don't doubt that they'll be able to. I mean, they've done a very good job with Resident Evil 4, and I just hope that they don't cut out content and try to add new things that make the game better than what we got originally. But those are all the positives I have about the game. I just want to briefly discuss the negative aspects of the game because there are a few things that I was not a fan of when I first played the game years ago, but the list is very short, and after that I will wrap up with my final thoughts. So there are a few things that I believe needs to be fixed, and I'm sure they will end up getting fixed because Capcom is really good at implementing combat features that improves the quality of life to the game while also making the games a more enjoyable experience. But my first one on this list is the Tyrant boss fight on the plane. This is something I already mentioned before because I cannot stress how badly this fight on the plane needs to be fixed, because the entire fight being in a closed space with an enemy that has charged special attacks sucks. It's the worst thing about this fight, especially because you need to lure him in front of a trap that will shoot him out of the plane, and it just takes so many tries and a lot of deaths. I ended up starting to save multiple saves at the same time, so if I screw up, I can go back to a previous save and make sure I preserve more ammo than I have. It's just the best strategy that I've found so far on how to complete this. But yeah, this boss fight was just such a struggle for me, especially if you're a new player like I was. It was just very frustrating trying to complete this. Unless you are some macho Resident Evil player who can go at this with a knife without dying, go right ahead. But for most of us, we're going to be using our main equipment for a boss fight. But yeah, this is just something I hope gets fixed. Let's get into the next one that I have on my list here. So this other one is a small complaint, but the tank controls suck. And I know this is going to be immediately fixed, but I just want to mention this for anybody who hasn't played with tank controls on a Resident Evil game before, but they are especially difficult in Code Veronica, especially because this game was designed for a completely different platform than what you're probably playing on. But I just wasn't a fan of it in this game. I'm sure plenty of people love the tank controls and probably would want a setting in the remake, but to me, they can do either or. It won't make a difference for me. I would prefer the over-the-shoulder third-person controls like what we have been getting, but yeah, this is just a quick little mention of the tank controls because I'm just not a fan of that at all. But the next one on my list here is the voice acting, which will definitely get fixed. Obviously, a lot of these are just stuff that's just definitely going to get fixed regardless, but the voice acting was pretty bad in this game. And before you tell me it's because the game was old and it was old when these voice lines were recorded, I still think that Steve had the worst dialogue out of anybody in the game. And that poor voice actor just sounded so awful in this game. And I don't know, it makes it a little jarring to go back and play this game, especially if you're not familiar with the old Resident Evil dialogue as some of us OG fans are. I think if it wasn't for the amazing story and gameplay, then this game probably would have been a throwaway because of how corny this dialogue really is. It makes you laugh just playing it because of how awful the dialogue lines really are and how much of a creep Steve comes off as. I mean, while they're on the plane heading to Antarctica or the base in Antarctica, Steve is just such a creep watching Claire sleep. It's just so weird. But yeah, let me get into my next point. Now, the last point that I have here are limited save points, and this is something that will obviously be fixed with autosave in the remake, but playing the older version was extremely difficult because the save points were very far and few in between, and it made moments where you died so painful, especially if you forgot to save before a big boss fight. And getting killed basically sets you back like, it could be 30 to an hour, and you'd have to go all the way back to that point and remember to save that time or else you'd be screwed again. And this was something that I wasn't a huge fan of in this game, especially because the older Resident Evil games had a lot more save points that I was more accustomed to. But yeah, these were all of the small things that I could really think of for complaints. I really love this game. I think it's one of my favorite Resident Evil titles of all time. Again, if I missed anything that you guys are aware of, just let me know down in the comments section so that other people who are planning to try this game out can get a good idea of what to expect when playing the game. Resident Evil Code Veronica is a very fun but challenging game, and I'm glad that Capcom has announced that they are planning on remaking this game, because so many fans have been asking for this for a really, really long time. And I believe that this would fit perfectly with the franchise, and it would really shine a spotlight on Claire and Chris's relationship before we go any further into future installments of the Resident Evil game. I also think that this would shine a nice spotlight on Claire and Chris's relationship, as we really haven't gotten to see them interact with each other in any of the remakes so far, and I think it's very important for people who are new to the franchise and might be missing this piece of lore that has been established back when the game released. And it would just be very important for this game to get a remake. Like I've said before, I think that this is definitely next in line to get a remake, especially because the amount of hype and anticipation Code Veronica's remake has. This game would be the best choice for a remake to get fans up to speed before we get into future games. But yeah, that is Resident Evil Code Veronica for you. I love the game so much. It's one of my favorite older Resident Evil titles, and I can't wait to see what 2025 brings for this franchise, especially if Code Veronica is in the works, as Capcom has announced that it is. But yeah, if you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe and also comment your thoughts down below. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and have a good night.